export activities by running sector-focused network groups, seminars, conferences, and we organize a lot of joint export activities all over the world, also in Russia. Today we offer you a webinar about the Russian food manufacturing industry. It's a market with great potential for Danish suppliers, but also a little bit complicated sometimes. So to give us an overview of the industry and to touch upon some of the main challenges, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Mr. Christoph Spank from Schneider Group. Schneider Group is located in Moscow and have offices in other countries as well, and they offer hands-on support to companies entering the Russian market. Christoph has been with Schneider for nearly 4 years and is team leader of the market research team. He has actually lived and studied in Denmark, in Germany, and now based in Moscow. And in a few minutes, I will leave the screen to him. But before that, just a few practical informations. This webinar is recorded and you will receive it afterwards. You can ask questions during the chat, or in the chat during the presentation, and I will try to follow up on these questions and interrupt the presentation if necessary. We have the challenge that me and Christopher cannot hear each other, or at least I can't hear Christoph, but I guess we will try to improvise a little bit. We will end this webinar at 11, and if all of you can hear still, please let us know in the chat, and that's all from my side. I will actually hand over the screen and the speaking time to you, Christoph.
Super.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Heidi. A warm welcome from Moscow. My name is Christoph Spank, as Heidi has already mentioned. I work in Schneider Group. Schneider Group itself is a company that has 3 core values, or our mission basically is to build a relationship between East and West by helping our investors in Russia in particular to implement and to form a relationship with the market in particular. Schneider Group has been founded by Ulf Schneider in 2003, initially as an accounting outsourcing company. Initially, we started with 5 employees. Now we are more than 500 employees. The company has grown from an accounting outsourcing service provider to a one-stop partner in Russia, Poland, Austria, and CIS countries. We have now actually offices in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Armenia, in Uzbekistan, and other countries, and we help basically companies doing business in these regions. As you can see here, this is a bit of a timeline of our company. Initially founded in 2003 in Moscow, and we've gradually, conquered the Eastern European market. And the latest office opening actually was this spring, actually in Austria in 2020. It's my pleasure now to talk a little bit about Russia and to introduce you to the Russian market, let's say. And let's say at the beginning there are a few points, in general points about the Russian market that I would like to run you through for those that are not as familiar with the market, as some of you are already who have a presence here in the market already. And we'll start out by saying, well, Russia is obviously one of the largest countries in the world. It spans about 9 time zones. It has 147 million citizens, and because it is so large, logistics is one of the key key challenges to anybody who's entering the market here. What can be said, let's say, is that regardless of the size of the market, most of the population is actually centered around metropolitan areas. The population of Russia, due to historical circumstances, is let's say multi-ethnical, which actually is a great potential and a very interesting opportunity for, let's say, also the food and beverages that are consumed in the country, and offer great opportunities actually for foreigners as well. The procurement is primarily driven by income, and there's a great income inequality that I'll get to in a second in the country, which actually needs to be taken into consideration. However, the society itself is quite tending towards Western values, and I would say Western standards as well. On the business side, Russia faces a lot of prejudice. Question is that justified or not? But what is let's say clear is that the Doing Business ranking by the World Bank actually shows a clear improvement within the last 10 years from ranked 120 to rank 28, which obviously is a quite a big improvement and a quite step forward. Denmark, on the other hand, of course, is at place number 4. So there's quite a bit of a difference in between the two still, but Russia is on a good way, as you can see by the numbers that are displayed here. The purchasing power in Russia obviously is very diverse, as I already mentioned. There are the metropolitan centers in the country, which are, let's say, the 10 largest cities, which you can see here on the screen. But even in between those cities, the purchasing power is very diverse. Moscow, obviously, way ahead with an average monthly salary of around 1,300 euros. Led by or followed by St. Petersburg, already only with 900 euros, and then the difference to the next cities is quite large, and this needs to be taken into consideration when supplying to Russia and supplying to companies who are located in Russia, in particular to companies who are not located in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Hence, what we always recommend to our clients is, in particular, those companies who can offer affordable solutions to the Russian market are those that are of great advantage, or they can do great business here in the country. Now we'll talk more about the agricultural market, since this is about food in particular. You see on the map here the main agricultural areas of the country. This includes as well meat and poultry. And what you can see, if you can see the cursor, I'm not sure about this, but maybe someone could just point it out. As you can see, basically, the main regions in Russia for agricultural production of meat, production of dairy products, are located in the south, southwest, and in the west of the country. We'll get to more concrete examples in some time, but basically this is important to keep in mind, because these are, let's say, the regions that you would be most working with. When it comes to fishery, of course, you would have the Far East, the Pacific Fleet, located, let's say, closer to Vladivostok, closer to Japan, if you want to say it like this. And on the other hand, the Northern Fleet located near Murmansk, and on the other hand, also, let's say, in this area of St. Petersburg, Leningrad Oblast, where there's also large fishery in the Baltic Sea area going on. Let's talk about the Russian consumer, because in the end, basically, any product that you will be able to sell will eventually have an impact on what the consumer here will be facing. Russians consume quite a lot of meat, 75 kilos per person. Poultry is the predominant meat, of about 35 kilos. But even more so, people produce dairy products, milk products. Among the most popular ones are kefir drinks, a drink called smetana, or it's not a drink, it's actually a sort of sour cream that is used as a side dish to many other dishes here in the country. Cottage cheese, tvorog, is very popular here, especially in the mornings. People consume this for breakfast. And what stands out is the amount of money people spend on meat, which obviously is not so much, around 25 euros per person per month, which is not so much in comparison. So this is necessary to keep in mind when you think about how much are people able to spend, and how much can the products that are being produced actually cost that consumers will eventually be able to purchase. So the production of meat, fish, and milk products. Obviously, poultry products, when we take a look at meat, poultry products are the predominant thing in the market, followed by pork and followed by beef. Lamb and other, let's say, goat products are actually also available in the country, also being produced, but primarily for, let's say, in the south, primarily for the let's say, Islamic regions in the country that don't eat eat poultry, that eat pork products, in particular, and therefore that's, let's say, a niche still in the market. If we take a look at the structure of dairy products in particular, as I mentioned before, kefir, yogurt products, sour cream stand out and are consumed quite a lot, and also being produced quite a lot. And types of fishery, as mentioned before, the fleets in the Pacific and the fleets in the Baltics and the Northern Sea actually mainly produce fresh or chilled fish for export, for usage in the country. We'll get to fishery in a second when we speak more about, let's say, the facilities that are in the country. But before we get there, we should take a look at, let's say, the largest market players in the country. Market players in particular, and I know some of you are already in the market, so some of these names actually should ring a bell. Miratorg, obviously one of the largest companies in the market, has quite a large market share and the production of quite a substantial amount, 426,000 tons last year, followed by Čerkezovo. And others, as you can see here, are, let's say, quite small in comparison. And what is worth mentioning is that a lot of companies, let's say, there's a number of companies that are very large, those displayed here, and there's quite a large number of smaller companies that are serving, let's say, more regional markets, whereas those large players are actually serving the domestic market as well as the export market. We'll get to this more in a second. When we come and take a look at the largest players with regards to turkey and broilers and so on and so forth, some of the names actually are familiar from the previous slide. There's the company Čerkezovo, for instance, Research or Damante. And if we take a look at the producers of dairy products, we see, for instance, Wimbildon as one of the largest dairy producers, or Danone Russia, obviously then subsidiary of the international firm Danone, or Hochland, a subsidiary of the German company Hochland. What is particular here is that companies, for instance, such as Danone or Hochland, actually have made use of the opportunities to localize their production, simply because the sanctions that will also be mentioned in a few minutes, offer some incentives for localization at the same time as they restrict access to the market for those companies who do not localize, which in turn also offers opportunities for suppliers to those companies. But before we get there, let's take a look at the market players for fish. What you see on this slide are actually the largest fish producing companies in the country and their quotas from the previous year. As was actually initially said on one of the previous slides, the current output of the fishery industry is about 1 million tons per year. Now that is a lot, or it's not a lot. That depends on your, let's say, perspective. But the government's plan is actually to increase that fivefold to up to 5 million tons per year by the year 2025, which obviously is a large challenge for the industry, in particular, considering the fact that the vessels that are being used are quite outdated. We have some, let's say, information that some of these, actually only 1% of the fleet is younger than 5 years, and 7% of the fleet is older than 25 years. So in the past year, actually, in past months, actually, the government of Russia has introduced a program in which the purchase of new shipping vessels or new vessels for fishing actually can lead to an increase in quotas for catching fish. So it's basically an incentive to renew the fleet and to work closer towards that goal of increasing the total fish caught to 5 million until the year 2025. So here we'll just take a quick break from the presentation, and there's, let's say, a quick question that we would like to ask you that we'll get to the answer in a second. Our question to you is actually, are you already selling in Russia today? What is your way of doing business in Russia, and what are your plans in Russia? We'd be happy if you can just quickly type there, and then we'll get to the answers of this question in a second when we get to another slide. So major CapEx projects in the market. There is a list of 90 projects, investment projects, that has been approved by the Russian government in December 2019. And these CapEx projects actually have a total volume of about 500 million euros. What you can see on the slide here are some examples from this list that we have picked. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Russian geography, I'll show, let's say, where these facilities will be built in a second. But what you can see basically, or a few words about this list, basically the list is comprised of investment projects that are being done and supported by the government, but primarily being done by international and national investors here for production facilities, for facilities of research, and in order to increase the output of meat that is being produced in the country. Why is that? Because about 10 years ago, the Russian government has actually started an initiative that eventually had the goal to introduce a self-sufficiency in the production of meat and other agricultural products. If you think back a little bit, Russia has traditionally, for instance, been a traditional exporter of grain, for instance, but over many years actually had to import grain because not enough was actually grown in the country. Now this has turned around in recent years, and Russia is now a net exporter of grain and wheat in the world. And with regards to meat and poultry and fish, this is still, or is actually continues to be the goal of the government, actually, to become self-sufficient and do not rely on imports to the country. This obviously is a great opportunity for international investors to help basically facilitate that goal and to contribute by delivering technologies, delivering machines, and so on to Russian companies who are basically putting in place this goal. What you can see here is basically 4 examples from pork production, from production of sheep, from production of cows or beef, and aqua production of salmon in this particular case. And I will just run you through the locations of these real quick. If you give me a second, I will just share my screen with you. So in the hope that you can actually see my screen now, I would just, once again, Moscow over here. The aqua production facility is in Leningrad Oblast, which is this area here close to St. Petersburg. And this particular case that is on the slide and that you will be receiving in after the presentation is actually located in this area over here. The production for pork and beef are located in the Krasnodar region, as well as in the Stavropol region, which is down here. So it's basically along the Black Sea. If you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, one of the areas of the primarily areas for agriculture in Russia is this particular area down here, as well as some areas here and here. And the Samara region is actually this area over here, where the... Sorry, I just get back to the presentation. where the production for the dairy complex is going to be built.
Christoph, maybe you can hear me. Yes.
Yes.
I don't know if you have I don't know if you have answered this question, but we have one here about aquaculture production. Where is it mainly taking place? Aquaculture and processing. I don't know if you showed that on the map.
Sure. No, I think I might have mentioned it, but then let me just go back. Since you, Heidi, cannot hear me, I'll let's say see to it that we'll show this. The main agricultural production would be in this area here. This is the so-called Black Earth district in Russia, as well as in this area. This area is also very rich in good soil. So potato production, wheat production, all these sort of things take place around this area as well. So when we look at Russia, when we look at agricultural, I would say this area here and as well as this area over here. These are the classical areas for agricultural production. So, Heidi, did you hear? Okay. So let's take a look at general trends and upcoming trends as we see them, actually. One of the first things that obviously comes to mind is, because the country is so large, storage and transportation is one of the things that is always an issue, because the place where the products are being consumed is not necessarily the place where the products are being produced. Hence, the storage and the transportation to the places where consumers are is a major issue in the country, and this is actually where I would say the country is lagging behind quite a bit. If we take a look at, let's say, away from meat, but fruit and vegetables, for instance, storage facilities are one of the largest issues that have an influence on the fact how much product is actually spoiled before it gets to the market. What we see is that the major players in the market, the ones that we mentioned before on the slides, are heavily investing in storage facilities and processing facilities, both in the regions as well as centrally here, for instance, in Moscow or Moscow region, in order to vertically integrate and thereby keeping parts of the profits in-house, and in order to have full control of the supply chain. The consumption of dairy products we see actually stagnating over the last couple of years. One of the reasons is the inaccessibility of high quality milk, which has to do with the sanitary conditions on the farms. There's a lot of investment potential on these farms, and due to, let's say, lack of hygienic conditions, and which also obviously present an opportunity for Western businesses to implement. The output of milk on a daily basis fluctuates quite a bit, which brings producers of dairy products such as cheese or other companies into the problem that the input volumes obviously on a daily basis fluctuate, and thereby they face the difficulty of production. Now, unfortunately, some have resorted to, let's say, some unpleasant ways of dealing with this problem by adding substances to the milk, for instance, that are, let's say, counterproductive to the taste of the product. Hence, a lot of Russians prefer, for instance, to buy foreign cheese, even though it costs a multiple of the cheese that is produced locally, simply because the taste of the local products is not good, to say it plainly. One, of course, has to take into consideration that foreign cheese is obviously, we'll get to this in a second, not cheese produced in Denmark or produced in Italy or produced in France. It is in most cases cheese produced in Iran, Brazil, Argentina. In the best cases, it comes from Switzerland, so that's not a bad option either. But obviously, this cheese is quite expensive and not possible to be afforded by many people in the country. And when we come to meat production, we actually see that because the country has worked towards self-sufficiency, it in some subjects has already overfulfilled self-sufficiency, the the need for exporting the products into other markets is rising quite tremendously, because there's an oversupply in the market, which obviously puts pressure on prices, and then favors those companies that, or those producers that can, let's say, afford, due to their size, actually to have lower production prices than let's say smaller players. And this is one of the things that that we see and will see increasingly in the future, if we talk about upcoming trends as we see them. The economic impact of the current crisis, which is so in Russia, not just a health crisis, but also an economical crisis due to the devaluation of the ruble. Just a quick word about it: the ruble has devaluated against the euro, for instance, by about 17% since the beginning of this year. Obviously, that's quite a lot when it comes to thinking about importing of goods and any, let's say, technologies, which is in turn also why I mentioned before suppliers of affordable solutions have an opportunity in the country. But industry concentration and consolidation will take place, where a larger or a number of large competitors will be the predominant players in the market, and smaller and regional players that basically serve the local markets will have difficulties staying in the game or eventually disappear. There is, of course, let's say a tendency that we see of diversification, especially of the smaller and the regional players, to diversify away from let's say mass meat and into, let's say, green meat, for instance, by serving local niches that are still existing, because there are still consumers that are able to afford products at, let's say, a higher price. But this number is, of course, limited in comparison to the large rest. So both will continue to exist, but we believe that there will be a concentration in the hands of the larger players. Now, consumer behavior will obviously shift as well in the case of such an economic crisis. What we see as well, and we'll get to this, let's say, the impact of this crisis at the end of this presentation, is that salaries have been reduced over the last couple of weeks, and obviously disposable income therefore also drops, which makes people down trade from more expensive versions of meat like beef to pork and turkey or poultry. What we see from in the industry itself, how the industry copes with that, is that we will see the usage of whole carcasses more often than the production of fillets, for instance, simply because it's easier to produce. It's more inexpensive to produce, and it's quicker to bring to the shelves. We see an increasing demand for frozen products also in the regions. So, producers of machinery for frozen goods or for freezing meat and so on have an opportunity there, simply because in towns like Magnitogorsk, for instance, there's usually one large employer in the country, which are factories of various kinds. And once these factories actually start reducing wages or start laying off workers, and disposable income in these regions actually drops, then the urge of consumers in this case is to put meat in the freezer and store it for later consumption, rather than, let's say, buy regular meat in the store and consume it on a let's say immediate basis. So we'll see, let's say, demand for freezers and frozen meat increasing, and simultaneously we will see a search for more locally produced goods that are independent from import prices, and simply because if a devaluation of 17% since the beginning of the year takes place, and at the same time salaries are being cut, people have even less money available to spend on imported goods that actually will, we see this already, increase in price. So people will start using or consuming locally produced goods even more. Let's take a look at import and export. As I mentioned before, Russia is striving for self-sufficiency in many areas. And if we just take a look at the areas where, let's say, beef and or meat in the meat market, meat and fish market, the products that are mostly being exported and imported, you can see that import, the beef takes the top part, followed by milk and dairy products, frozen fish, poultry, and canned fish. Whereas the export, apart from, of course, agricultural products such as wheat or grain, is actually taken by frozen fish, chicken, fish fillets, and pork, for instance. And if you take a look at the import and export destinations, I mentioned before that, for instance, a lot of cheese actually comes from Argentina or from Iran. Excuse me. Companies or countries such as Belarus, for instance, obviously a neighboring country and part of the Eurasian Economic Union as well, are heavy suppliers of sausages, of dairy products to the Russian market. And so is Turkey, for instance. A lot of fish, for instance, that is brought to Russia actually stems from Turkey, for instance. Top export destinations are the neighboring countries, such as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, but also China, Vietnam, and Hong Kong. And this is especially the later three, China, Vietnam, Hong Kong. They are, let's say, the markets of hope for the dairy industry, for the meat industry, in particular the pork producers, simply because so much pork is produced in the country that there is no demand for that in Russia itself. So producers are forced to seek export markets, and China is one of the big hopes in the country. Now let's take a look at the legislative regulations affecting the industry that we see here, let's say in the last couple of years. I mentioned before this import substitution policies that the Russian government has actually introduced in order to reduce the dependence from imports. This, together with, let's say, the counter sanctions on agricultural products and foods that have been introduced after the Western sanctions were put in place after the problem that arose in Crimea, have led to the situation where basically the import of a lot of agricultural products, meat, fruit, vegetables, cheese, is no longer possible, but instead, what is requested or required by the Russian government is the localization. And this is actually the idea behind this initiative by the government is to ask and to force producers to localize their production in Russia in order to absorb the technology that is involved in the production process on the one hand, but also in order for the producers to be able to serve the Russian customers. And as we said before, there are 147 million consumers in Russia, but there's also the benefit of producing in Russia, for instance, or producing in the Eurasian Economic Union, by being able to serve the entire Eurasian Economic Union, which comprises a number of other countries as well, such as Armenia, such as Belarus. And all in all, this union has about 188 million customers that, similar to the European Union, can be served if certification and so on is done in this particular, in one of the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, of course, this is basically quite a harsh treatment to say you're no longer able to import to Russia, please localize, or you need to localize in order to participate in this market. This is what we call this carrot and stick approach, right? The stick is basically the threat to no longer be able to serve the market unless localization is done. And the carrot is actually done by agreements such as, or support measures that international investors actually can receive, such as, for instance, reductions in tax for income, property, transport, profit tax, as well as social contributions. Of course, in subsidies, when localizing in a particular area, or when a company has a particular size, or when a company is employing a certain number of people. by receiving preferential financing with low interest rates through various channels such as the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Industrial Development Fund, and other channels of the regions, or the signing of what is called a special investment contract, which is abbreviated there by SPIC2 on the slide, which basically gives the opportunity to act and become what we call a made in Russia producer. In some industries, this is actually highly sought after, especially if companies serve the Russian state. We see a lot of businesses that struggle with selling in Russia because they sell things that would primarily be sold to the state. And because the state actually then requires the origin of the product to be made in Russia, foreign companies trying to enter in such agreements basically lose out. Hence, there's an opportunity to localize your production or even part of the production in order to obtain the Made in Russia logo or Made in Russia certificate in order to participate in such tenders or such state initiatives of procurement. So this gets us to the question, how do I actually sell to Russia? What are the things that are required? And if we take a look at the export of machinery, for instance, since many of you are actually from this area, we've taken a look at certification of machinery, food processing machinery and packaging machinery. And traditionally, you would actually start by taking a look at the HS codes of the products, because, as I mentioned before, Russia, not being part of the European Union, but part of the Eurasian Economic Union, requires an independent certification. So the certificates that are good for working in Europe do not actually work here in Russia. Hence, a renewed certification is necessary. The initial step for what is necessary for certification is the look at the HS code, which then basically points us to multiple regulations. They're pointed here, or they're listed here on the slide. I wouldn't necessarily like to go into the details, but from the process of the certification, basically these technical regulations actually define the requirements that the product needs to fulfill in order to be certified in the Russian Federation or in the Eurasian Economic Union, and there will be able to be sold in this area. So how do I obtain this conformity document that is basically stating that the product is conformed to the norms of the Eurasian Economic Union? There are two options, and after the second option, I will actually give you a practical option that, let's say, is a bit of a mix between the two. So the first option refers to, let's say, tangible products that are small and can be shipped, and which can be basically shipped to Russia to be tested in a laboratory. So this is basically the way, the steps that have to be taken in order to obtain this conformity document, is that samples will need to be sent to Russia. For instance, if the certification is done here in Russia, in order to pass customs, a letter from the laboratory is required that requests the sending of samples. That is actually attached to these samples when it's being sent to Russia. The products are then being transferred to the laboratory. They are tested there according to the legislation and according to the regulations of the technical norm that corresponds to the product. And once these tests are performed and successfully performed, and registration is obtained, and the import of the good in larger quantities is possible. What is required, or let's say what is necessary to take into consideration, is that this process can only be initiated by an entity that is based in the Russian Federation or in the Eurasian Economic Union, a legal entity in this case. Hence, foreign companies that want to sell goods to Russia actually need a local partner, or else need a legal entity in Russia in order to be able to request a certification. Therefore, it's necessary to find what we call an authorized representative if the company decides not to open a legal representation by itself. Second thing that is important to keep in mind when initiating the process: the laboratories that actually perform the tests here in Russia are regularly being audited, and it is important to understand that before initiating the transfer to the labs and the tests at the laboratory, that to check if the laboratories that you plan to work with are currently being audited, or if by any chance they have been put on a sort of blacklist, or they have been listed red, as we say here, which means that the results are basically no longer possible to be used in the import. If you have questions to this, please see us, for instance. We'll be happy to give you more information about this list and where this information can be found. But it's definitely important to make a survey of basically if the laboratory that you plan to work with can actually issue the documents of conformity that are being valid after the check has been done. And last but not least, as I mentioned before, the laboratory sends then back a letter with a request for samples that is required for the initial import of the samples. It's not, as my colleague had put it on the slide here before, it's not rocket science, but it's still rather complicated. Hence, companies such as Schneider Group, for instance, are happy to help with this. Now, option number 2 is a bit more, let's say, difficult, and this is a case where you would traditionally have large machineries that are that cannot be sent as samples because they are too voluminous or too heavy to be sent. So in this case, a contract with this laboratory that I mentioned earlier is actually done, and then an expert from the laboratory is coming to, for instance, Denmark or wherever the producer of the machinery is actually located. He performs the tests that are required here in the Russian Federation on site with the machines, takes these tests or the results, sends them back to the laboratory, and through this way, basically registration is performed. And then the registration leads to the letter of conformity, which in turn then allows the import of the machinery. This is quite complicated and it's very expensive. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's even impossible to do due to the fact that the travel restrictions well, almost I would say worldwide travel restrictions are in place. So it's impossible to get an inspector basically out of Russia to inspect the machine at the current time. We hope that this will change soon, but this is something that is unfortunately at the moment not possible. Now, a practical tip from our side: if there's a third option, let's say, that we have not put on a slide, but this is what we see a lot happening with, let's say, larger machines, where not option 2 is actually being put in place, but rather the machine is sent to Russia and imported, let's say, conditionally for a period of up to 45 days. And then, just as in the example that you see here, the visit of the expert in the foreign country, this expert is actually then visiting the machine or the place where the machine is and performing the tests in the country. And basically the importer, which in this case is also the Russian legal entity, has 45 days in order to complete the process of certification of the machinery, or else is forced to re-export the product, which obviously can be quite challenging and can be quite expensive. Hence, that is, let's say, a good middle way between the two options, but we see this option actually to take place quite often and to be a preferred option by many who in particular sell large machinery. So import and customs in Russia. This is basically just a quick illustration how goods are actually imported to Russia. I would just run through this because I've explained a lot already before. So you see the manufacturing, either being sent directly to Russia by the manufacturer, where at the border, basically the import and requires the certification of the product. Both for import and for certification, a Russian legal entity is necessary, or basically the work through a partner who has a Russian legal entity, such a distributor, and so on and so forth. Or the work through a distribution center, basically the same way. what is interesting when it comes to raw materials, but I don't think that this is really the case here, is that obviously when raw materials are being finalized in Russia, for instance, or in the Eurasian Economic Union, and then being re-exported to Europe, the certification for the final product in Europe is also needs to be available as well. So when does customs start? Basically, customs starts at the moment when the documents are being checked. And the documents in this case are usually in the first place being checked by the Russian legal entity. In most cases, it would probably be your distributor who's asking you to send him all of the required documents for the import process. And it will be important to send him all of the documents beforehand and wait for, this is why we call it green light initiative or green light process. It's important to check that with the distributor until he gives the green light, until all of the documents, customs documents, export control, sanctions, checks, and so on and so forth are performed. The verification of the document is performed. And there's also the verification of the labeling, which is also, as in our experience, can be a big stepping stone that can lead to the blockage of import at the border. And only when your local partner or the Russian legal entity gives the green light for the import, then send the products to the border, or else there's a high risk that they will be stuck at the border, which has quite a bit of problematic consequences with regards to the costs that are involved with getting them away from there and storage and so on and so forth. The next slide basically illustrates that to some extent as well, where we see basically the responsibility of the manufacturer, which is basically here, complying to the technical regulation in the left-hand part of the slide, complying to the technical regulations, the export control in the home market, sanctions regulations that need to be taken into consideration, the national security laws, and the labeling, obviously, which is done usually by the producers of the goods. Then we move to the middle, and this area is usually taken care of by the business partners here in the country. Information that they require, correct data of all of the documents, confirmed values, conformity documents, appropriate labeling, and the documents clearance. And then they can finally move into Russia. And this is where then basically, depending on your model of operation, your local partner or the legal entity here in the country are responsible for. Documents to be provided. This is the contract, the price list and the commercial invoice, the packaging list, the technical description, which is usually like a one-pager, including pictures that can be checked at the border, whether the goods that are in the container actually correspond to the technical documentation. The valid conformity documents, the correct transportation documents, and the insurance in some cases. What is interesting is that for those goods, in case there are some that have, for instance, hard drives or Wi-Fi or Bluetooth included, a special permit from the FSB. FSB is the domestic security service. Basically is required in order to be able to import products into the market. Now, all of this basically leads us to, from our perspective, to three scenarios of how goods can be imported. And we would like to kind of run you through those three scenarios in order to give those of you who are not yet in the market an idea about, let's say, how things can be set up. So it all starts with the requirement that the certification of the products in the Eurasian Economic Union and the import of products to the Eurasian Economic Union are only possible when a legal presence in Russia is available. This can be either through a corporate legal presence of your own company or through the corporate legal presence of a partner. It can be a distribution partner, or it can be a third party. So you see basically all three options down at the bottom of this slide. And in our experience, when clients come to us and ask, okay, what is the best possible way for me to do business in Russia? we usually ask, okay, what is your goal? What is the where do you see yourself in 5 years down, or in 2 years down the line? If you are actually doing quite a lot of business here in the country, then of course opening your own legal presence in the country can be the most effective and can be in the long run the cheapest option to work with. On the other hand, it involves constant, let's say, maintenance costs that need to be taken into consideration. There is the requirement for tax paying, the requirement for doing accounting here in the country. A general director needs to be appointed, and so on and so forth. So all of these are, let's say, headaches that come along with this. Or the work with a local distributor. Usually, local distributors know their market quite well. Hence, of course, it's a good way of starting to work in a new market. And it doesn't require a lot of, let's say, local market knowledge, simply because that market knowledge is provided by the distributor. On the other hand, and this is something that we see in our experience with working with hundreds of international companies here in the country throughout the 15, 16 years that we've been in the market now, is that at the very beginning, a relationship can look very fantastic. The local partner basically is taking care of all the marketing activities. The local partner is taking care of all of the import, payments, and so on and so forth. But what I usually tell my clients is the following. Working with a local partner or a local distributor is like getting in their boat. And then the distributor or the local partner basically decides which direction that boat goes. And if, for instance, at one point of time you start to disagree about the direction that this boat is heading, it can become very, very difficult to, let's say, jump the boat or even to find a new boat to work with. Simply because if you work with a local distributor or local partner, in most cases, these partners will obtain the certification of the product, that your product, in their name. Hence, they are the owner of this certificate in the country, and they can decide who can import this product and where this product is being sold. Hence, if you tend to disagree with your local partner about some sort of business operation, or you would like to head in another direction, this partner can basically block the import of the product to any other, let's say, third party, and can thereby basically shut down your operation in Russia without much difficulties. Hence, what we recommend to companies that are thinking about working with distributors is going, what we call here on the slide, work through third parties. Schneider Group, for instance, is such a third party. And what we offer our clients is, for instance, the certification of the product in our name. Schneider Group has a daughter company called Schneider Group Trade. And Schneider Group Trade is the holder of many hundreds of certificates of various industries. And what basically we do is we certify the product in our name, since the legal presence is here, and then make available this certificate to any partner that our clients actually would like to work with. Hence, our partners can work with the same distributor as they would have initially wanted to work with, but that distributor does not hold the certificate. If then our client decides to switch distributors or to switch partners, basically this client is just pointing in another direction, and we will make this certificate available to any other partner that this client would like to work with. So in the long run, it saves the client the headache of being, let's say, taken hostage by a potential partner. This is something that we've developed after we saw many times how partnerships at the beginning were going really well, and eventually when basically the partners decided to part, it turned very, very ugly. Now, a few words about Schneider Group. I mentioned already that what we do is helping companies to gain entry into the Eurasian Economic Union, into the Eastern European markets. And basically our theme is, let's say, market entry, business setup, and localization as a general rule of thumb. We help develop companies from the initial export to the market, then to grow, and eventually then to set up local production in order to make the best and the most out of the local market. How do we do this? As I mentioned before, I'm responsible for market research, and what we offer our clients, for instance, are dedicated market analysis about the market, competitor analysis, price comparisons, but as well as partner search and distributor search. If you're thinking about entering the Russian market and you're unsure about a partner that you would like to work with, our recommendation is find a local source that you can trust, use the network that is available here, and reach out and inquire about, let's say, the whereabouts and the background of this potential partner before you enter a cooperation, in order to avoid future trouble. This is all, all of these things are the things that we as Schneider Group help you and help our clients with. Furthermore, we offer the possibility, as we call it, market representative, which is intended for small and medium enterprise business who have, let's say, limited financial resources or limited human resources that they would like to employ in the market, but on the other hand, have a great product and would like to kind of test the waters. So what in this case we do is, we as Schneider Group become the representative of you and your client, your product in the market for a limited period of time, in order to test how the product is going and how the sales could potentially develop. The minimum period of time is 3 months, but in our experience, it takes about 6 months to place the product in the market. If this is something that is of interest to you, we'll be happy to talk more about this. Reach out to us, and of course, we'd be happy to discuss this further. Now, I've come to the end of this presentation. And of course, there's one topic that we should briefly discuss, simply because it's on everybody's mind, which is the coronavirus, which unfortunately has also taken hold of Russia. So a few words about the situation in Russia. As you can see, basically, by the environment that I'm sitting in, it's not the office of Schneider Group that I'm currently in, but instead I'm working from home, just as many of you are working from home. Now, Russia has been, let's say, lagging behind the general development on the world stage with regards to the infection numbers. You can see a slide here, and you can see that as you say, flatten the curve is only very limited happening at the moment here. Unfortunately, the infection rate is still between 15 and 16%. But what has been, let's say, on a political side or a legislative side has been implemented is that on March 28th, the government actually has decided to introduce a so-called non-working week. It started as a 1 week non-working week, and has now been extended until April 30th at least. And we're anxious, of course, to hear if this is going to be prolonged one more time or not, and to what point of time, of course. But what this basically means is that any non-essential businesses are subject to closure, so they are not operating. Of course, food producers, agricultural producers, and so on are characterized as essential businesses, since the food supply of the population depends on it. But let's say the administrative side usually is shut down, or actually sent to home office, and so on and so forth. This has led to quite a disturbance in the country's economy. A lot of resources had to be mobilized, because what this degree of shutdown also involved, let's say contrary to the name non-working week, is that the salaries have to be continued to be paid. So a lot of employers are actually facing the difficulty of having to pay their employees, whereas they cannot generate any revenue due to the closure of their businesses. And this is something that is going to affect a lot of businesses here in the country, and hence also will have quite an impact on the economy once the sanctions, or not sanctions, but the restrictions have been lifted, in particular to their finance capabilities. And this is why, if you think back at one of the first slides that I showed, in particular, companies or suppliers of affordable solutions will have an opportunity of gaining market entry, simply because the financial resources are depleting on the consumer side as well as on the employer side, simply because many Russian consumers actually do not have large savings. So along with the, let's say, shutdown of the businesses, went a salary reduction, in most cases about 20%. Legislation in the country says it's easier to reduce salaries than to lay off people. Hence, employers resort to this. But we will definitely in the near future see this situation taking or getting impacting also the sale of food and consequently agricultural products and machinery and so on and so forth. Now, with the, let's say, shutdown that has taken place, and this is the last point, Heidi, before you come in, the restriction of movement actually has been put into place as well. You can see on this picture there is actually a QR code that since last week, actually everybody that is going outside other than going to the nearest store, going to bring out the garbage or going to doctor's appointments actually will have to obtain on the internet and will have to present in case of checks by the police. Starting from tomorrow, checks by the police, especially checks by road police, are being done more thoroughly, and the CCTV cameras that are introduced or that are installed here in the city quite widely are also being used to prosecute people who are operating their cars without having prior obtained such a code. So you can see that basically the modern technology that has been introduced over the last years into the country is now being taken also to some extent to control the population and thereby also to control the further development of the coronavirus in Russia. And with this, I thank you very much. Unless, of course, you have any questions, then I'll be happy to stay on a bit longer and we can discuss them afterwards. And in general, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to hear from you. You can reach out to Heidi or to me. And if you happen to go to Agroprotmash in October this year or next year, we'll be happy to see you at our Moscow office at Schneider Group as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and we hope to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And I think you will be happy to hear that I have actually been listening to you for at least half of the presentation, so the sound came back. Now the time is actually up. So I think, first of all, I will say thank you very much to you, Christoph, for this introduction and also to address some of the major challenges when doing business in Russia. To all of you listeners, thank you very much for attending. We will actually close down now, and if you have a few questions, I know that there's a few questions we did not answer during the webinar. We can answer them afterwards, or you can actually also have a direct contact with Christoph afterwards. So thank you everyone for listening in, and for those of you with a few questions, we will stay on for five minutes more. Thank you. And Christoph, I have actually wrote down a few of the questions that came in, and I know that some of them are very specific, so they might be it might be something that you will talk to the people about directly afterwards. Sure. But at one point you showed a map about where the major industries are located in Russia, and some of the listeners couldn't see it. I know they will be able to see it in the recording. But there was one specific question about aquaculture, fish farming.
Yes.
Maybe you can tell us where this is mostly taking place, and where's the processing taking place? Exactly. There it is. Maybe you can show the map again.
Yes. Let me just show you. Let me just see if I can reactivate the map. Can you see the map now, Heidi? Heidi, can you see the map? So, in the hope that you can actually see the map.
We can see it now.
Yeah, okay, super. It just takes a second, apparently. So, St. Petersburg is over here. And the particular projects that we mentioned before is located here in this area. And this is just one example. So, I this morning just checked once again. For instance, I read a large aqua farm that is being implemented, and that is going to also include a production facility, which is going to be located somewhere in the vicinity of Murmansk here at the White Sea area. But in addition to this, I also know that fish processing also takes place in this area here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Then there's one specific question from the dairy industry. Valio used to be have a very good presence in the dairy market. What happened to them? Do you know? Do you know that?
Honestly, this is I would have to take a look into this. I'm not actually aware of this brand at the moment, but I'll be happy to look into it and then come back to whoever asked the question.
Perfect. No problem. And then there's the same person actually also have a specific question about exactly that one about Iran. Maybe that's also a specific one.
No, actually, I just because it's a bit difficult here to see the questions during the webinar. I saw this one, and with particular emphasis on Iran. What comes to my mind is that just yesterday I read an article with an interview from President Putin, who said that the extension of the Eurasian Economic Union at this moment, at this critical time as well, should not necessarily be pushed too urgently or too quickly. So let's say the joining of Iran to the Eurasian Economic Union, I'm not sure that we're going to see that anytime soon. I would suspect what is going to happen much earlier are trade deals that are being done bilateral in order to facilitate the cooperation. Iran already, as I mentioned before, supplies a lot of dairy products. And in our business as consultancy, we see a lot of Iranian producers also trying to get onto the Russian market. There's always the risk with the American sanctions. And this is also why, let's say, business partners in Russia are to some extent hesitant, especially those that have dealings abroad as well, because in many cases they would become subject to the US sanctions or subject to US restrictions on dealing with Iran as well. This is why I believe it will take still some time.
Okay. I can see there's more specific questions about Iran, but I suggest that you will actually take that with the listener directly. There is only one question that's been asked a few times regarding to the CAPEX projects and the list of the 90 projects. People are interested in this list, but they can contact you for this list, right?
Of course. If you would be so kind, you've seen my email address during the presentation. If you haven't noted it down, it will be in the presentation that Heidi will supply to you afterwards, or you can reach out to Heidi directly, and she will be happy to give you my email address, and then you can reach out to me directly, and we'll be happy to send you the information that we have on these CAPEX projects.
Yes, we will make sure to forward your contacts together with the recording of this webinar to all of you. Okay, I think actually we will conclude this session. And once again, Christoph, I thank you very much for joining us. And with the small technical difficulties, we actually managed to do this. And I think that is something that is very cool that we can do. We can do more from home than we expected sometimes. So yes. Thank you very much, Christoph, and thank you to all listeners for being part of this session.
Yes, thank you, Heidi, and thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.